Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Extension Development Studies, SOEDS, Certificate Programs, Certificate Program in Value Education, CPVE, BEDS 004 Application and Support Skills, Block 1 Working Towards Inclusiveness, Unit-1 Need and Concept of Inclusion-Caste, Class, Gender and Disability, 1. Introduction. Inclusion should be viewed as a value, a set of humanistic beliefs that have been enshrined in our Constitution. Indian Constitution clearly reflects that all individuals irrespective of caste, class, gender, and ethnicity are valued members of society. Inclusion is a process through which we discover our similarities rather than our differences, and we focus on our strengths, not our weaknesses. Sign does not reflect a place where special education is provided, but in a larger sense, a way of life and a way of thinking about the future of our children. By providing our children with opportunities to have meaningful relationships and experiences within their family, school, and community lives, we are enabling them to reach their fullest potential as adults. NSERT's National Curriculum Framework 2005 rightly states the education system does not function in isolation from the society of which it is a part. Hierarchies of caste, economic status, gender relations, cultural diversity as well as the uneven economic development that characterize Indian society also deeply influence access to education and participation of children in school. This is reflected in the sharp disparities between different social and economic groups, which are seen in school enrollment and completion rates. Thus, girls belonging to SC and SENT communities among the rural and urban poor and the disadvantaged sections of religious and other ethnic minorities are educationally most vulnerable. According to UNESCO, inclusion is increasingly understood more broadly as a reform that supports and welcomes diversity amongst all learners. Under this broader definition of inclusion, steps should also be taken to eliminate discrimination and provide accommodations for all students who are at a disadvantage because of some reason other than disability. This unit will help you to understand the idea of inclusion with reference to caste, class, gender, and disability. 1.2 Objectives. At the end of the unit, you should be able to explain the meaning and concept of inclusion, explain the meaning of caste, class, gender, and disability, explain the need of inclusion in education, explain the need of inclusion of caste, class, gender, and disability, perspectives in education, describe contextualization of curriculum for the inclusion of caste and class, gender, and disability perspectives. Appreciate the idea of inclusion for a cohesive society. 1.3 Concept and meaning of inclusion. If we aspire for an inclusive society, we have to ensure that our education system is truly inclusive. As has been stressed in the educational policy of 1986, inclusion may be achieved bringing under its umbrella the tribal and rural poor, the backward minority groups, and the mentally and physically challenged children, all of whom have been neglected for too long. The necessary prerequisite for building an education for a composite culture is to ensure that all our children not only have access to education, but are also given equal educational opportunities as well as education of acceptable quality. India is a highly populated country with its 1 billion people of diverse groupings characterized by multicultural, multilinguistic, and many religions. But in spite of many onslaughts on India's democratic polity and threats to its secularism and pluralism, India has remained committed to the secular and democratic values laid down in the directive principles of our Constitution, which form an indispensable part of the educational policy of 1986. It is essential that our state-run and secular schools should be open to children of all communities, castes, and religions. They must cater to their different cultural and linguistic needs and provide an educational environment which is non-threatening, does not alienate or divide, accepts differences, and yet seeks to provide an overriding culture that is composite in nature, based on the ideals that India treasures: secularism, social justice, equity, and a democratic way of life. This diagram is by the CBR Network, South Asia. CBR is an international NGO working towards networking of all NGOs active in the field of community-based rehabilitation and education of persons with disabilities, women, and rural development. It illustrates that inclusive education means inclusion for all groups in society. L.4 Concept of inclusion, caste, class, gender, and disability perspective. Though inclusion is more commonly used in the context of children with special needs, the concept of inclusion of caste, class, race, and gender are also emerging as forms of social inclusion. Inclusion is seen as a universal human right. The aim of inclusion is to embrace all people irrespective of caste, class, gender, and disability. It is about giving equal access and opportunities to all learners and getting rid of discrimination and intolerance, and thus facilitating removal of barriers. It affects all aspects of public life. Inclusion is a state of being valued, respected, and supported. It's all out focusing on the needs of every individual and ensuring that the right conditions are in place for each person to achieve his or her full potential. Inclusion should be reflected in an organization's culture, practices, and relationships that are in place to support a diverse workforce. Inclusion is more relevant in a pluralistic society like India, which is diverse in terms of caste, class, language, ethnicity, religion, etc. In simple terms, diversity is the mix, inclusion is getting the mix to work well together. Though, in India, there is no formal or official definition of inclusion, it does not only mean the placement of students with sane in regular classrooms. The draft scheme on inclusive education prepared by the MHRD 2003 uses the following definition. Inclusive education means all learners, young people with or without disabilities being able to learn together in ordinary preschool provisions, schools, and community educational settings with appropriate network of support. 1.4.1 Concept of caste. Caste is an institution which is truly Indian in character. So much so that even the concise Oxford Dictionary defines it as Hindu hereditary class with members socially equal, united in religion, and usually following the same trades, having no social intercourse with persons of other castes. The word caste itself is derived from the Portuguese word casta, which means pure or chaste. In the Indian lexicon, we refer to caste by the words varna, meaning color, and jati, which is derived from the root syllable ja, which means to be born. 1.4.2 Concept of class. Usually, class stratification begins with people who are on the same economic and cultural level, with only a few people wealthier or less wealthy than others. As time goes on, wealth and status begin to concentrate around a small number of the population. As people spread out more from one another economically, classes are created. When a physical gap is added, a cultural rift between the classes comes into existence. For example, the perception of the well-mannered, cultured behavior of rich people versus the so-called curt, uncivilized behavior of poor people. With the cultural divide, chances for classes to intermingle become less and less likely, and the divide becomes more common between them. The lower class loses more of its influence and wealth as the upper class gains more influence and wealth, further dividing the classes from one another. 1.4.3 Concept of gender. Gender refers to the social attributes and opportunities associated with being male and female and the relationships between women and men and girls and boys. These attributes, opportunities and relationships are socially constructed and are learned through socialization processes. They are time-specific and changeable. Gender determines what is expected, allowed and valued in a woman or a man in a given context. In most societies, there are differences and inequalities between women and men in responsibilities assigned, activities undertaken, access to and control over resources, as well as decision making opportunities. Gender is part of the broader sociocultural context. Gender roles are closely linked with gender stereotypes. Stereotypes are overgeneralized beliefs about people based on their membership in one of many social categories. Gender stereotypes vary on four dimensions: traits, role behaviors, physical characteristics, and occupations. For example, whereas men are more likely to be perceived as aggressive and competitive, women are viewed as passive and cooperative. Traditionally, men have been viewed as finance providers, whereas women have been viewed as caretakers. Physical characteristics and occupations have also been considered consistent or inconsistent with masculine or feminine roles. Gender roles and stereotypes affect men and women in other ways also. Specifically, men and women may be judged by how well they conform to traditional stereotypes. 1.4.4 Concept of disability. Disability is often described in terms of lack of normal functioning of physical, mental, or psychological processes. It is also defined as learning difficulties or difficulties in adjusting socially, which interferes with a person's normal growth and development. Around 10% of the world's population suffering from one or the other disabilities is the world's largest minority. Disability rates are significantly higher among groups with lower educational attainment in the countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The World Bank estimates that 20% of the world's poorest people are disabled and tend to be regarded in their own communities as the most disadvantaged. The persons with disabilities do have outstanding abilities. In recent times, the abilities of these people are recognized and encouraged to bring them to the main stream of the society. 1.5 Need of inclusion in education. There has been increasing dissatisfaction amongst educators in many countries with the practice of special education, which separates the so-called disabled. Freedom of conscience and religion. Only a person who is religiously free in a twofold sense, free from the prejudices bred by the priestly class and free to know the spiritual core of his own religion, can respect the freedom of conscience and religion that others are entitled to. We are trying to inculcate in students the freedom of the spirit, to respect the rights of others, to pursue their religion without hindrance, a dynamic work culture. To educate is to activate and empower the potentialities latent in human beings. Knowledge and skills are never ends in themselves, but are valuable tools. They are to be used in the pursuit of human welfare. Selfless service, a wish to be served, is innate in human nature. What needs to be cultivated is its opposite, the motivation to serve others. A culture of peace. Peace is the most desired value in theory. The learning experience made available to the students must include opportunities to cultivate the strengths required to live in peace with all sorts of people. This calls for the ability to live in harmony with differences and contradictions, the capacity to think objectively, and the willingness to respect the sanctity of the life and liberty of other. 1.7 Contextualization of curriculum. Inclusion of caste and class perspectives. For effective inclusion, curriculum should be contextualized as per the diverse needs of the learners. The idea of caste and class-sensitive education cannot be actualized unless equality will be treated as a curricular and pedagogical concern. One of the main ways to stop caste and class discrimination is through appropriate educational training, which is focused on considerations of caste and class and on the upgrading of the image of these groups. In targeting this, priority must be given to curriculum, textbooks, and pedagogy, which are vital for building a new gender, caste, and class concept. Most of the times, the knowledge given in textbooks reflect that legitimate knowledge does not include the experiences and forms of expressions of those people who have not been in powerful position. Throughout history, for example, women the disabled or people of lower caste and class, etc. The experiences and interpretations that are constructed in these power relations do not provide enough identifying links and models for those students whose experiences are excluded from the legitimate knowledge taught. Knowledge and experiences of these groups need to be included in the very construction of knowledge. In the process of doing so, a contextualized curriculum will ensure the following: 1.7.1 Learner-centered environment. Effective learning begins with what learners bring to environment. This includes cultural practices and beliefs, as well as knowledge of academic content. Evidences show that learners apply their current knowledge and construct a new paradigm of interpreting this knowledge. 1.7.2 Knowledge-centered environment. The ability to think and solve problems requires that knowledge of a subject area be accessible and linked to current understanding. Designing of curriculum and content areas should be such that it helps students learn with understanding instead of promoting the acquisition of disconnected sets of facts and skills. 1.7.3 Community-centered environment. The learning environment should promote a sense of connectedness to the community. Classroom norms should encourage students to learn from one another and one another's environment. Learning in schools should be connected with outside learning activities. 1.8 Inclusion, gender perspective in education. Incorporating a gender perspective does not mean seeing the world from a female PT perspective. By exploring men's and women's use, needs and experiences related to educational facilities, expectations and perceptions can be expressed and explored. This in turn allows us to probe deeper into questions of why there are differences and how gender relates to issues of sustainable development, health, safety and access. Gender perspectives and gender equality principles are critical to ensuring that all boys and girls are able to benefit equally from education and get equal opportunities to promote more gender-responsive and gender-equitable educational systems and structures. Yet the gender challenges are great. Boys and girls, men and women experience shifts in gender roles, relations and identities, creating new education needs. MD and female teachers also have different experiences and different priorities that need to be addressed. When education is viewed in terms of its transformative potential as a social intervention that works towards re-examining existing realities, then it becomes the single most powerful process for redressing the inequities of gender. It can facilitate the forging of new values and forms of society that would enable both women and men to develop their human capacities to their fullest. Efforts are also being made under SSA to generate a community done and for girls' education and enabling conditions for people's and women's participation to create the push factors necessary to guarantee girls' education, motivation and mobilization of parents and the community at large, enhancing the role of women and mothers in school-related activities and participation in school committees, and strengthening the linkages between the school, teachers, and communities are some of the ways in which the enabling conditions are being created. Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan's perspective of inclusion of gender in education suggests the following: free textbooks to all girls up to class BIU. Separate toilets for girls, back-to-school camps for out-of-school girls, bridge courses for older girls, recruitment of 50% women teachers, early childhood care and education, ECI centers in near schools, convergence with ICDS program, etc. Teachers' sensitization programs to promote equitable learning opportunities, gender-sensitive teaching learning materials including textbooks, intensive community mobilization efforts, innovation fund per district for need-based interventions for ensuring girls' attendance and retention. Schools, through parents-teacher associations and community involvement, can initiate the following actions: sensitize communities of the importance of girls' education, develop strategies to ensure that women and girls as well as men and boys actively participate in education meetings and in trainings. Example, pay attention to appropriate meeting timings, locations, provide childcare facilities, consider single-sex meetings, include women and men on community education committees, and provide gender training if necessary to ensure their voices are heard and taken seriously. Engage women and men in school-related activities such as school feeding, arranging escorts to school, parents' mobilization, engage local community, especially women and girls, in the design and location of school sanitation facilities. 1.9 Inclusion, disability perspective in education. Inclusive educational practices are being endorsed internationally. The UNESCO-sponsored Education for All initiative states that all children, including those with disabilities and other special needs, are entitled to equity of educational opportunity. UNESCO and the OECD have also determined that inclusion is the preferred approach to providing schooling for students with special needs. It is widely accepted that the conditions required to allow for successful inclusion are also those that contribute to overall school improvement and high levels of achievement for all children. As a result, inclusive education has received more attention in the last few years. There is a movement toward more inclusive schooling in almost every country. Examples of good practice exist, but the models need to be strengthened and made more systemic. The time is right for key stakeholders to invest in programs and initiatives that will help make schooling in home communities possible for all children. To include disability perspectives in education, support provisions need to be made very effective. Supported inclusive education refers to the opportunity for all students, regardless of their disability, to be educated in age-appropriate, general education classes in their neighborhood school in natural proportion. All necessary supports are provided to students and educators to ensure meaningful participation in the total school community. Regardless of disability refers to inclusion looks different for every student, based upon the individual needs, strategies, and resources required, and can accommodate students with the full range of disabilities. Age appropriateness refers to placement in a class with students within 1 to 2 years of the chronological age of the student. Neighborhood school refers to the school the child would attend if he did not have an educational disability. Supports, as far as supports are concerned, supports can include, but are not limited to, curricular or instructional strategies, peer supports, ID team teaching strategies, assistive technology, environmental adaptations, specialized instructional strategies, additional adults in the classroom, integrated and consultative related services, dependent upon the unique needs of each student. Class and district supports will be different for each student. Inclusive education requires creative thinking in providing these supports and a redefinition of roles. Inclusive education also involves supports for teachers regarding planning time, training and technical assistance, collaborative teaming, parental involvement, administrative support. There are a number of other initiatives that experts have identified as supportive of the move toward inclusion. Some of the more crucial ones involve establishing pilot projects in individual schools or clusters of schools, incorporating best practices, and developing local strategies, training a cadre of teachers and school principals so they, in turn, can train others, paying teachers sufficiently so they can focus on teaching and be held accountable for student success, providing teachers with training in classroom strategies so they can accommodate children with diverse learning needs in regular classes, strong schools with support teachers to provide collaborative help to classroom teachers, developing information packages on best practices and disseminating the knowledge, creating education institutions that prepare new teachers for inclusion, forming partnerships between schools, parent groups, NGOs, and government and professional groups in the promotion of inclusion in schools and the community. 1.10 Role of teachers in inclusion. The purpose of education is to enable people to live meaningfully and fruitfully in their society. For this goal to achieve, it is not enough to see education as a means for propagating knowledge. It is imperative that students be enabled to develop a spiritually wholesome personality that relates to the society in terms of give and take. The keenness to take, without the grace to give, degrades human beings into predators. And it is doubtful if this can be achieved without an efficient teacher. The effectiveness of the curriculum depends, in the long run, on the skills and attitudes of classroom teachers. The Open File on Inclusive Education, UNESCO, 2001, suggests that the following demands be placed on teachers from the perspective of inclusive curricula. 1. They need to become involved in curriculum development at the local level, and they have to be skilled in curriculum adaptation in their own classrooms. 2. They need to manage a complex range of classroom activities. They need to know how to support their students' learning without giving them predetermined answers. 1. They need to work outside traditional subject boundaries and in culturally sensitive ways. A case study from Brazil. Luca is a boy with Down syndrome. He is 11 years old and is in the second grade. Ms. Rita is his teacher and she participated in the 2004 Action Research, Project Planning and Teaching the curricular content by using inclusive strategies in which the UNESCO material, Changing Teaching Practices, was used. During this project, Ms. Rita had noticed that Luca was excluded by his peers from taking part in the classroom activities. She also saw that Luca reacted badly to this rejection. She decided to observe what was going on between Luca and his classmates during the break. To her surprise, Luca's classmates were nagging him and refusing to play or to stay with him. Ms. Rita began an approach to this situation by creating a classroom discourse about how each one likes to be treated by others. Then, she invited the students to think about friendship and how they like to be treated by their friends. After this reflection, Ms. Rita asked each student to contribute to the lesson with his/her view on this issue of friendship and wrote a list of words given by them on the blackboard. Then, they read the words together and chose the most relevant ones to become their guidelines to relate to their classmates. Ms. Rita led the students to reflect on their behavior with friends and then asked them to monitor themselves and support their colleagues in treating all students equally. In order to consolidate the new 13 behavioral achievement, the teacher initiated a series of campaigns, including the welcoming campaign, the greeting campaign, the Can I Help You campaign. Naturally, without focusing on Luca's situation, Ms. Ixite created a positive environment for Luca and for his learning. So from that work he became one of the classroom groups and was treated as a mate by his peers. Today Luca participates in all activities, he has settled down in his behavior and he has friends, just like the other students in his class. The case quoted above give us a point to reflect that to make inclusive education possible and to better accommodate students with different learning abilities, the present education system, educational structure, and educational practices need to become more flexible, more inclusive, and more collaborative. 1.11 Summary: Inclusion is about giving equal access and opportunities and getting rid of discrimination and intolerance and thus removal of barriers. It affects all aspects of public life. However, inclusion is more commonly used in the context of children with special needs. The concept of inclusion of caste, class, race and gender is also emerging as form of social inclusion. Special education is seen as simply reinforcing problematic inequalities and exclusion. Inclusion in education is needed because it is cost-effective and needed for social cohesion. For effective inclusion, curriculum should be contextualized as per the diverse needs of the learners. A contextualized curriculum ensures learner-centered environment, knowledge-centered environment, and community-centered environment. The learning environment should promote a sense of community. Classroom Norms should encourage students to learn from one another and one another's environment. Learning in schools should be connected with outside learning activities. To build an inclusive society and a composite culture in a country, diverse and plural as India, is not an easy task, especially at a time when local and regional identities are being rigorously asserted, when certain communities are feeling isolated and alienated from the political and civil polity, when there is such marginalization of the socially and economically deprived sections of our society, so much poverty, illiteracy, and social injustice prevail, and when the majority of women are still disempowered. These are the issues that need to be addressed. Education has a key role to play in bringing about the social and economic transformation of our society, without which the building of a composite culture and inclusive society will remain a distant dream. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.